Hello everyone, I'm Erica and today we're going to learn how to paint trees using watercolor paint. Welcome to the second part of the Watercolor Landscapes for Beginners series. So this is a series in which we're breaking landscapes apart into different elements and creating studies of those elements in order to create a complete landscape at the end. If you have not watched the first video, which is all about creating sky studies, water, and mountains, you can check out the link in the description box below. Today's video is going to be all about painting trees. I'm going to be showing you how to paint 6 different types of trees, and I hope you'll follow along with me. So get out those supplies and let's get to work. Okay everyone, so these are the 6 different types of trees that we're going to be practicing today. I honestly have no idea what these are called. I'm a very bad plant person and I don't know much about plants or trees, but I basically chose 6 different types of trees with different sizes and shapes. I did a little quick research to find out different types of trees so that we can practice not only one type of tree but a variety of them in terms of sizes and shapes. This way we can practice different types, and if you're not interested in practicing them all, that's fine, just pick and choose whichever you like. A very important note that I would like to mention before I forget is that it is extremely important for you as an artist to start building up that visual information in your head of what things actually look like in real life. So go out and look at trees in this case, or at the very least look up high quality pictures in the internet and use those as your painting. In terms of the supplies that we will be using for these studies, I personally used only 2 different types of brushes. I used a round 10 and a round 8 brush, but especially if you want to practice doing the winter dry type of tree, having an even thinner brush is going to help you a lot. I used thick 140-pound watercolor paper that I cut up into smaller sections. You could, however, use a sketchbook that is mixed media or intended for watercolors if you prefer. Watercolor paint, of course, a cup of water, a paper towel or a rag, and a pencil and an eraser. Before actually starting to paint the trees, I would like to ask you to loosen up your hand by doing some scribbling on a scrap piece of watercolor paper or any type of paper you'd like. This is something that I love to do myself, and this scribbling technique is pretty much the base behind painting the leaves of the trees, the way we're gonna be painting them. So the way that I would describe scribbling would be holding my paintbrush just about touching the surface of my paper and very slightly, very gently moving it both up and down and sideways at the same time. So you're making both vertical and horizontal movements with your paintbrush in small sections across your paper. Allow your hand to move freely, don't try to control it, loosen up. You have to get this down because this is the way that we're going to be painting pretty much all of the leaves of the trees. And also experiment with creating gradient effects while scribbling. So take a bit of paint and water in your paintbrush, place it on your paper and start scribbling. Start distributing that paint around your paper to create a natural looking gradient. Remember to stay away from solid blocks of color, and always keep in mind throughout these studies that since we are doing something natural, things have to look organic and irregular. Okay, so I created these 6 tree studies in 2 separate phases. In the first phase, I basically very lightly sketched out the general tree shape using a pencil. And I also added in the first values of my paint, so the lightest values. And then in the second phase, I went in with the darker values. And the reason why I decided to do this in 2 phases was because I knew that I was going to arrive at a point at which I had to allow my paint to dry. So basically you're going to see me work on the first phase of the 6 trees. And when I'm done with the first phase, I'm going to move back or cycle back to my first tree to complete the second phase. So once I was ready, I went ahead and drew my pencil sketch very lightly, and I started adding in my first light layers of paint. I created my first set of color mixtures by using yellow ochre, cadmium yellow light, and permanent green olive. Now, you don't have to use exactly these tones. Use whatever you have, but I really recommend that your very lightest tone has at least a little bit of yellow in it, because by adding yellow, you're going to add a warm tone, and you want to create the effect of a bit of sunlight hitting some of the leaves of the trees. So go ahead and start placing your initial layers of paint. Make sure they're very light and translucent, and make sure that you are leaving white spaces in many areas, because remember that when we see trees in real life, we're able to see the sun and the sky through the leaves and the branches of the tree. So you always want to leave white spaces. And also something important to notice here, guys, is that as opposed to the sky that we were painting last week, for this one, we are not using the wet on wet technique. I'm actually going on and painting on dry paper. So you can already start seeing how, depending on what it is you're trying to paint, you have to think of how you're going to go about it in order to create the effects that you want to create. When you are creating those layers of paint, don't worry too much if your paintbrush accidentally dips into a more yellow paint or a darker paint, and some areas of your tree look a little bit darker than others. Allow these things to happen naturally. It actually creates a very nice variety in tone throughout the leaves, which makes it look very nice. Try not to be such a perfectionist. Learn to let go and allow things to happen naturally. This is one of the characteristics of watercolors that make it such an interesting medium. You have to learn to work with its characteristics and allow it to do what it wants up to a certain point. While you're working on this first half of your tree studies, this first phase, try to use your intuition in order to decide until what darkness you take it to, or until what value you take it to. I usually like leaving the first half at a sort of medium green and allow it to dry before then going in with darker tones. Also experiment with creating wet on wet effects in certain areas of your tree and leaving it more defined in others. Something that I really want to remind you of at this point is to do your best to not overwork. Try to be light about what you're doing. Try to add darker values where necessary, but not all throughout. Remember, as I said in the first video of this series, you are not trying to cover up previous layers of paint. As you move on placing darker values, you just want to place those values in certain areas. So before starting with the second phase of these studies, I created my darker values. And to do that, I used my permanent green olive mixed together with ultramarine blue to make it slightly darker. And then I made an even darker value by adding some sepia brown. Now, once again, you do not need to use these exact tones. All you need to do is to create darker values of your green. What I do not recommend is that you start adding black. As many of you may know, it is not recommended for you to use black, except for very specific situations. Black tends to flatten everything out. In most cases, when I am painting with watercolors, I create my darker values by mixing together my color with either a dark blue, a dark brown, or there are also cases in which I use the color that is next to the one that I am using in the color wheel. So for example, if I am painting something that is meant to be orange and I am creating a darker value of orange, I add in red, which is next to orange in the color wheel. Or if I'm painting something that is supposed to be yellow and I want to create a darker yellow, I add in orange to my yellow to make a darker hue. If I am painting something that is purple, I mix it together with blue, which is next to purple in the color wheel, and so on. While you're in the second phase of your studies, try not to be so heavy-handed with those final darker values. Remember to leave parts of the lighter values visible and only add the darker values wherever you see fit. Try to be very deliberate with where you place your darkest values. You want the lightness to show through always. Create at least a little bit of a variety in values, even in your tree trunk and or branches. And the way that I personally did this is by lifting a bit of my paint with my rag. This way, it's not going to look like a completely flat block of color, especially since brown is such a dark color. You don't want it to look like a uniform flat block of color. By simply lifting off a little bit of paint here and there, you're able to create a sort of texture and a more believable 3D effect. Personally, I always leave my tree trunks and my branches until the very end because they are going to be a very dark color, and with watercolors you're supposed to paint from lightest to darkest. It is also helpful to leave the branches until the end because since you're already done with your clumps of leaves and you already have little spaces or little holes showing through the clumps of leaves, you are able to decide whether you want to place some branches in those spaces. So how did it go, everyone? Were you able to follow along? I would love to know which type of tree was easiest and which was hardest for you. Let me know down in the comment section. Make sure to come back next week because we're going to be studying how to create rocks, grass, and flowers, so smaller details in landscapes. Thank you so much for watching and being here today. I really appreciate it, and don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. See you next week. Bye!